Steve is the Educational Outreach Coordinator of the National Organization of Circumcision Information Resource Centers, and for the past 5 years, his research has focused on the anatomy and function of the foreskin. He has designed multimedia presentations for use both by healthcare providers and for the public educational forums. He is a regular guest speaker for the Department of Human Sexuality at the University of Utah, and he has presented on this topic at national and international medical conferences. He is also the director of NOCIRC of Utah and provides Utah parents and physicians with information and educational material. Now, this is a real important talk, so pay attention.
Okay, I'd like to begin today by saying nicotine is not addictive. And you know the rest of those lines. It happened just down the road here. So if we could get like a group together of the American Academy of Pediatrics, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the family practitioners, the urologists, et cetera, to appear before the Congress on a panel, and they were asked what the nature and function of the foreskin is, their answer has to be, in unison, the foreskin is useless. The foreskin is useless. The foreskin is useless, and they'd go right down the line. The reason, of course, is because if you admit that what you're surgically ablating from children is of any value, then you're screwed, to put it bluntly, on ethical grounds, on legal grounds, but we've talked about this before. So what got me interested in this topic was about 10 years ago I was writing an article on circumcision, and as part of the research, I interviewed physicians in the Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo area. This is in Utah. And one of the questions that I asked them, what is the nature and function of the foreskin? And almost unanimously, they had no idea. A couple of them recited a passage from a pamphlet that's produced for parents by the American Academy of Pediatrics that we'll take a look at in a minute. But apart from that, they didn't know. And the reason they didn't know, I found out from subsequent research. I went and camped out in the medical library for about a month and a half, looking through all the pertinent texts. And I have to give credit to all of those people who've gone through the index and those P's, in the index over and over again. You'll almost always find penis, especially in urologic texts. But very rarely will you find the word prepuce, which is the anatomical medical term for the foreskin. And in fact, in diagrams of the penis, the prepuce is absent in many cases, especially in nursing texts. So given that the prepuce is absent in these texts, there's nothing that medical students learn about the anatomy and physiology of the prepuce, apart from how to excise it. So that was quite an astounding revelation to me, because I thought every part of the human anatomy had been examined in detail. And I just anecdotally, when I talked to John Taylor for the first time, the fellow that discovered, if you will, the Freener band, or the ridge band of the inner mucosa of the prepuce, when I asked him if there was anybody else doing research on this topic, he laughed out loud. And anybody, any of you that know John, he's got quite a dry sense of humor. You wouldn't catch him laughing out loud very long. The reason is because his answer was, in the era of cancer, where would we find funding for primary research on anatomy and physiology? It simply isn't done that much anymore. Unless there's a disease involved, then there's all kinds of funding for it. So, could we have the lights and turn on the projector, please? So I'd like to acknowledge, before we start, some people that have contributed to this material. The slides of the female genitalia were offered by the publishers of this publication, Femalia. And I'd also like to acknowledge John Taylor, who has provided us with autopsy material transparency data, and Chris Cold, a pathologist, and also the late, great John Erickson, who has provided us with real, actual photographs of living genitals of the male. So what we're talking about here is the foreskin. But what is the foreskin? I mean, when you look at the skin on the penis, it's quite different from any other skin on the body. The skin on the body usually is attached to underlying structures. The eyelids and the skin that covers the penis are exceptions. As you see, the skin is attached, well, in this diagram it isn't, attached to the abdominal wall, but once it reaches the shaft of the penis, it's free and loose from the underlying shaft. So it rides up and over the corona, or the the raised ridge of the head of the penis here, comes out, then it doubles back in. There's a ridged area that we'll talk about later, then a smooth area. All of this area in here is mucosa, and then it eventually finds its circumferential point of attachment right here at the coronal sulcus, or the groove behind the glans. So the glans is the name for the head of the penis. And here we see the skin that in a flaccid penis would be on the outside is pigmented skin. It's like the skin, similar to the skin on the rest of our bodies. But when it takes this little turn, it changes into mucous membrane. This doesn't mean that it produces mucus. It's just a histological term, and we'll take a look at exactly what the difference is between what they call true skin and mucous membrane in just a little while. And just a little point that I'd like to make, this little area here where this attachment occurs, this is anecdotal. It's not reported in the literature, but I think we ought to give respect to anecdotal evidence, especially given that the medical profession is not willing to do any research on it. It's all we've got to go on in some cases. Although I do want to make the point that the information I'm going to be giving you today is based on primary research. Primary research is when someone takes sections out of a living human being, puts them onto slides, and analyzes them histologically. That means that they're taking a look at a cellular level at what's going on there. You can identify all kinds of things if you take a close look at it. So the information I'm going to give you is supported by research over the last 75 years from Dogil in Germany, Munger in Germany, Halada in the United States, Winkelmann in the United States, Taylor in Canada, Cold in the United States, Parkosh in India, and it goes on. And I've got copies of the article that I wrote for the last plenum book, and I know that you're all kind of pissed off at the hotel right now, but I do have to say they provided these free, so you can pick one up afterwards. And just so we know what we're talking about, here's a diagrammatic representation of the female genitals. These are the labia minora, the small lips. These are the labia majora, or the large lips of the vagina, or the vulva. This is the vagina. That's the entrance between the vulva, which are the external configurations of the female's genitals, up to the cervix. This is the glans clitoris, which is the counterpart to the glans penis in the male. There's the foreskin, or what they call the clitoral hood of the female. In female genital mutilation, as Soraya pointed out, all different types, they would be removing this part if it were a radical female genital mutilation, and the labia minora, and then suturing, in some cases, the labia majora together. So let me just go back here a second. So when we define circumcision, what are we talking about? In equatorial Africa, it would be perhaps just the removal of the tip of the foreskin, or the practice, as many of you know, up until 140 AD of the Jewish community involved only the clipping off of any foreskin, any skin that protruded beyond the head of the penis. The style of circumcision that's practiced in the United States would make the incision somewhere around here. So what you would be left with is penile skin that's pigmented, then a scar line, and then some degree of mucous membrane. Here's a style of circumcision that was promoted in 1917, where they would excise a large portion of the penile shaft skin, then evert, that is, unfold the what we would call the foreskin back and suture it up. It would have the same cosmetic results. And when I show this to people, they're horrified that they would be cutting off shaft skin. But in actuality, as we shall see, this would probably be a kinder, more gentler form of circumcision. And starting somewhere near the beginning, these are diagrammatic representations of the genitalia of the embryo at 8 weeks gestation. This is called the genital tubercle. Oh, looks like you're all going to have to twist your heads around. This is backwards. But there's the male and there's the female. These are called at the 8-week stage the genital tubercle. They'll become the glans penis in the male and the glans clitoris in the female. The labial scrotal swellings will become the labia minora in the female. The labial scrotal swellings will fuse together as the phallus elongates under the influence of hormones and become the penile raphe. And the scrotal swellings, I'm sorry, those are called the urogenital folds that will become the labia minora and the raphe. The Labial scrotal swellings will become the labia majora in the female and the scrotum in the male. And here's an actual photograph. At around this time, 8 weeks, male hormones initiate the development of the male's genitals. And under the influence of these hormones, a phallus is created. So this gland's, what's going to be the gland's penis, migrates forward as this phallus is created. Here's a side view of the elongating phallus. And this is a picture of the genitals of a male at 12 weeks gestation. It's at this time that you can see a groove that demarcates the shaft from the glands. And around this time, there's a fusion of the folds on the underside of the penis that works in this direction, eventually fusing up near the glands. And the way that the foreskin is formed, this would represent somewhere around 9 weeks. It's a specialized fold of tissue that grows out of the coronal sulcus, and as it moves forward, it enfolds the gland's penis. Some researchers even suggest that it's moving from the outside to the inside. And so this is from work by Hunter. These are actual micrographs of what's going on, taken at different stages in gestation, until around, depending upon the research you read, anywhere from 18 to 24 weeks, this complete enfolding of the glands is accomplished. And here we see the completion of this process. Here are the one of the corpora cavernosa, the bodies that fill with blood to create an erection. There's the urethra. And here's the glands, here's the foreskin, and you can see that this membrane that's shared by the foreskin and the glands, which is a common membrane, firmly fuses the foreskin to the head of the penis, and this is the way that babies are born. You can see from even this photograph that the prepuce, or the foreskin, and hopefully I'll call it the prepuce from now on because the foreskin is so misleading. You have to keep in mind this is one continuous skin that goes from the base of the abdomen all the way out, doubles back in, and connects at the coronal sulcus. So when we talk about foreskin, it's sort of a misnomer because, what are you removing? It's all just one sheath. So we can see that the prepuce, even at this stage, is much more complex. This red all represents vascularization, as opposed to the glands that we'll see in a little while is, neurologically anyway, pretty dumb organ. And here's a close-up, the prepuce, what is called the synechia, which is a Greek term that means to bind together. Some of us prefer not to use that term because the only definition in medical dictionaries regarding synechia is pathological. And so I prefer to call it the balano-preputial membrane. I know that's big, but balano is the Greek word for the glands. Prepuce is the Latin word for the foreskin, and so it's a balano-preputial membrane. So when babies are born, the foreskin is firmly fused to the head of the penis. In fact, one of the very first things you have to do in order to execute a circumcision is to literally tear the foreskin away from the glands. Now what happens, this is a really unique process. I haven't heard of this anywhere else in physiology. This comes from Hunter. Here's the foreskin, here's the glands, and here's this common membrane. Whorls of cells develop in the membrane, and they die from the inside out, leaving pockets, if you will. Eventually, these pockets coalesce, forming the preputial space. That would be the space between the prepuce and the glands. Here we can see this is autopsy material. Don't try this at home. This is the pathologist retracting the foreskin. Here you can see the ridge band. Here's an attachment still onto the glands. There you can see the frenulum, a bridge-like structure that attaches the foreskin to the underside of the penis. And here he's pulled those attachments free, and there you can get a good idea of the ridge band. There's also musculature involved that we'll take a look at in just a second. If he were to let go of this, the whole thing would spring forward and pop right back over the head of the penis because of the restraint of the frenulum under here and also because of the musculature. Here's a circumcised penis in contrast. I just want you to realize what a neat little package this is, how complex it is with its musculature and its high degree of colorization because of the high degree of vascularization, and the ability, literally, when this pathologist releases it, to pop back over the end of the penis. So one nice thing that the American Academy of Pediatrics has done is that they've, in their literature to parents anyway, have reiterated over and over and over again, do not retract the infant's foreskin. And they say this in their words because it can cause pain, bleeding, and adhesions. I would also suggest that it can cause a disease. You're tearing this back, causing open lesions, which are an entrance for foreign pathogens. If these pathogens colonize the preputial space, they can migrate up the urethra. Bam, you've got a urinary tract infection. And then, depending upon the education of the doctor, he'll say, well, see, I told you should have had him circumcised, when it was actually the doctor's misadvice to the parents to forcibly retract the foreskin, the prepuce. And actually, that quote came from the subsequent pamphlet from the American Academy of Pediatrics. The one before that had a little section here on the function of the foreskin. And briefly, it says that this is delicate tissue that's easily irritated, that it serves a protective function, and that this protection lasts throughout life. That's the only thing that I've heard from the medical community about function. Interestingly enough, in their next pamphlet, that section was gone. Now, Marilyn tells me when she got in touch with the head of the American Academy of Pediatrics at that time and asked why the function was left out of the pamphlet, he said there wasn't enough space. Well, yeah. So this is also a problem, not so much unless you've got a really invasive investigatory type of practitioner with females. According to the literature, and I found no primary research on this, the foreskin or the prepuce of the female develops in the same way that the prepuce of the male does. In other words, there's a migration distally away from the body and an enfolding of the glans clitoris. And that we know from research that the prepuce of the female is firmly attached to the glans clitoris of the female at birth, and that the separation takes an indeterminate amount of time based on the individual, and no intervention is necessary. But, like I say, if you get an invasive person that's digging down into the vulva of the female trying to find some pathology, then this was a practice that was recommended in the medical literature to free up these adhesions, to stick a blunt probe in there and ream around the clitoris of the female in order to break up these adhesions, unquote. The other thing that inhibits or prohibits the retraction of the foreskin in infancy is the dartos fascia. This is a muscle sheath that lies 1 or 2 millimeters under the epidermis of the outer layer of the foreskin. This is smooth muscle tissue, and as such has the ability to contract very slowly, but to remain contracted for a long time. And the way that this musculature is arranged, along the shaft of the penis, these muscle fibers go in a mosaic pattern, but when they get to the tip of the penis, they form a circular sphincter-like arrangement, which closes the end of the penis down. Now, keep in mind that this is muscle tissue, and it can either be relaxed or contracted. Let me just, this comes from an article, by the way, in which the author said that when you bring a baby in for well baby clinics or well baby visits, that you shouldn't be looking at this and saying, oh, that's too tight of a prepuce, we'd better circumcise. Even though it's just a pinpoint opening, as long as urination is possible, there's certainly no need for any intervention. His point was that depending upon the temperature, depending upon the attitude of the little child, that this musculature could be relaxed, and it may present in this way, where there's plenty of opening. The urinary meatus might even be exposed. So when a baby's born, the prepuce of a male baby is often very long. Sometimes it can be as long as the shaft of the penis itself. Tragically, physicians who are uneducated about the natural evolution of the penis through adolescence construe this to be redundant or extra skin, and they ask the parents if they'd like to have it trimmed off, when in actuality, under the influence of hormones in adolescence, the penis will actually grow into this foreskin and may, at maturity, fail to completely cover the end of the penis. Let me just go back to this. Hodges and Fleiss have also had suggested that this tubular, elongated prepuce of the male serves a function in infancy. There's a theory about urinary tract infections that females get more UTIs than males because the distance between the urinary meatus and the bladder is so short. And there's less urinary tract infections in males because the distance is longer because of the phallus. Well, this actually extends that distance, and it's because of the closing mechanism. Again, this is anecdotal. No physiologist that I know has reported on it, so excuse me for the anecdote. But from reports, it seems that this can actually twist down. So it's a one-way valve. Urine can pass out, but nothing can get in, unless you've got an aggressive manipulator of the penis. So here we are. Once the foreskin is able to be free of the glands because of the desquamation, if you will, of this balano-preputial membrane, and once the musculature is relaxed, which may take on up into adolescence, because this evidently happens under the influence of male hormones that are flushed through the body of the adolescent male. So now you have this free-moving skin. Got to stop pointing with my clicker here. There's the frenulum, there's the inner foreskin, the outer foreskin. And so when it's retractable, it then can evert. That is, the inside becomes the outside. So all of that mucosal tissue will now lie on the shaft of the penis. And here are just some basic morphology. Here's a diagrammatic cross-section representation of the penis. You've got this big, long thing. This is where the abdomen occurs. There's still more penis that goes into the perineum, and then you've got these crura, which is the plural in Latin for pillars or legs. And that would happen somewhere near the anus. In the female, we have the same sort of configuration. These are all homologous entities that migrate from the same embryonic tissue. We've got the glans clitoris, the body or the shaft of the clitoris, and then we have these crura, which compared to the male are enormous. Now, I'm jumping ahead here to physiology, but what happens is because these crura lie above the vaginal entrance of the vagina, this, according to the sexologists I've talked to, is the origin of the mystical vaginal orgasm, something that has nothing to do with the clitoris at all. And these crura are expanded as the penis goes in. Of course, because the corona is larger, they're going to be expanded more whenever the corona passes that area. And here's from Winkelmann from the Mayo Clinic, the difference between hairy skin, which is on most of our bodies, glabrous skin, which is skin that has no hair, and mucous membrane. What he's informed us about this is that the neural and vascular networks rise higher in the surface in mucous membrane. And in his words, this thereby favors more acute sensation, because everything is closer to the surface. And here we can see the pigmented outer skin, the mucous membrane, and the frenulum. And here's another good example of the frenulum, and the ridge band is kind of folded up there by the thumb. And here's the genitalia of a female. Here's the labia minora, which connect to the bottom part of the glans clitoris. And here's the foreskin, or clitoral hood of the female. It's interesting to note that there's two frenula in the female clitoris. And just as long as I'm here, so I won't forget, when we talk about clitoridectomy, of course, you saw the diagram of the penis. The clitoris is the glans clitoris, the shaft of the clitoris, and the crura of the clitoris. If you want to be correct about it, when we talk about female genital mutilation, if they're removing the glans clitoris, that should really be called a clitoral balanectomy. Balano, again, being the Greek word for glans, or the Greek word for the head. Anyway, the medical literature that's written predominantly by males says that this is an incomplete frenula because it hasn't fused yet, when in actuality, I would say she's got two frenula. And there's the clitoral hood, or the foreskin, which has the same ability as the male to invert and revert, to unfold and enfold. So when the foreskin everts, the inside becoming the outside, as a consequence of erection, this ridge band is continuous with the frenulum. The frenulum is a bridge-like structure that tethers movable objects to non-movable objects. And there was a thought in medicine for years that the frenulum was an erotogenic part of the male's genitals, and so there was a style of circumcision that was employed to try to retain some of this frenulum. There's a little tag of it right there. And here's a cross-section of what we're going to be talking about now, and this is the ridged band of the inner mucosa. There's 10 or 12 ridges. These are exaggerated because of dehydration, but these are millimeters up here. They're about 1 millimeter wide. 10 to 12 of them is 10 to 12 millimeters, which is a little less than a half an inch. So it's a small amount of area, but we'll see that it's highly invested with specialized tactile nerve receptors. Here's an especially long prepuce, autopsy material. You see the pigmented outer skin, the ridge band, the smooth mucosa, and the glands. And here's a transilluminated section of the vasculature of the prepuce. It's highly vascularized. Just an enormous amount of blood flows through this area. And there you can actually see the vascular blush that's often apparent at this site. Now, I've read accounts in the medical literature about frostbite of the glands in joggers. And in every one of those cases, it's always in a circumcised individual. You have to realize that one of the natural functions of the foreskin, given that it's so highly vascularized, is that it protects the whole penis, if you will, because, especially under the presence of cold, this dartos fascia contracts, draws the penis closer to the body. So if you have skin over the end of your penis, it's going to contract all along this area, pull the whole thing back in towards the body, and naturally be less likely to suffer frostbite. So just a real brief lesson in neurology here. There's there's so much confusion, neurologically speaking, about end organs, they call them. These are the specific kinds of nerve endings that are found throughout the body. The reason they call them end organs is because they're at the very end of these neural pathways. They would be at the very tip of everything that goes back to the spinal column. So we've got specific nerve endings, like the Pacinian corpuscles, which are located deeper in the dermis. They're sensitive to pressure. They're like onion-shaped arrangements where they have layer after layer. We've got Ruffini corpuscles, where are they? Like right in here, that are supposed to be sensitive to vibration. And recent research from New Zealand identifies that these are actually connected in some way to the connective tissue, so that any vibration that was felt down the line would register here. And then perhaps the most important in terms of erogenous sensation are the Meissner's corpuscles right here, that lie very close to the surface of the skin and have the ability to sense very light touch. And here we have a cross-section of this area of the ridge band where we can see in really high magnification, just in this one little area, 2 Meissner's corpuscles. And you can see how close they are to the epidermis. I mean, this, whatever this configuration is, it's going actually right up to the tip of the epidermis. So because they're so close to the surface of the skin, and because of their configuration that we'll take a look at in a second, they're able to pick up real fine receptors. Now these corpuscles are found in like the soles of your feet or the palms of your hands and in the ridged mucosa of the inner prepuce. If you want to get an idea of the sensation that's elicited by these nerve endings, you can take your fingernail and rub it across the palm of your hand. That little ticklish sensation with just the lightest bit of touch is what is Meissner's corpuscles that are picking up this stimulation, as opposed to rubbing your fingernail against the back of your hand, which would be more like normal, if you will, skin. And when the appropriate stain is applied, here we can see the actual end organ itself. These are pear-shaped, pine cone-shaped end organs. And here in higher magnification, you can see that they're made up of a ribbon-like arrangement that courses back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So the slightest little bit of touch deforms these and a sensation is sent. And what we find, this is from Taylor's work in Canada, is that there are clusters of these Meissner's corpuscles that are found in the crests of the ridges. Interestingly enough, they're not found down in the valleys or the sulci between the ridges. They're only found right up towards the top of the ridges. Here you can see one there, and here's a whole bunch of others that are going up to just one dermal papilla. And here's a cross-section. If the long axis of the penis were this way and the Meissner or the ridge band were going around like this is a section that's taken through the long axis like that. Every one of those black dots represents a Meissner's corpuscle. So this area of the body is highly invested with these specialized tactile nerve receptors. Here, in contrast, is a sample section from the smooth mucosa. This is a much larger magnification, or smaller magnification, so we're seeing a much larger area here. There's a Meissner's corpuscle, there's one, whereas before we were looking at one papilla with numerous Meissner's corpuscles. So the smooth mucosa isn't as highly invested with these tactile sensors as the ridged mucosa. And just as a note, this is absolutely fascinating research, I think. I just think neurology is amazing. But this is done by Cold in Wisconsin, who has found that these Meissner's corpuscles occur not only in the glans clitoris of the female, but they also occur in the prepuce, or the clitoral hood of the female. As in contrast to the male, let me see what's next here. Which so far anyway, we've only identified these specialized tactile nerve receptors in this area of the prepuce, but not in the glans. One of the most complex and interesting articles, and I've got all this stuff here if you want to take a look at it. I mean, I've got the real articles, by Halada Munger, is an article titled The Neuroanatomical Basis for the Protopathic Sensibility of the Human Glans Penis. And when they talk about protopathic sensibility, these are the very crude sensations that we experience of cold or pain. And that's essentially the way they describe the glans penis. It has a very few specialized tactile nerve receptors, and in the words of John Taylor, it's a relatively dumb organ, especially compared to the prepuce. So this ridge band with all of these specialized tactile nerve receptors occurring in the crests of the ridges is attached and is actually continuous with the frenulum. So depending upon the degree of stretch or the degree of erection, this band can lie anywhere along the penile shaft. And here from John Erickson we see this line represents where a circumcision would occur. This line represents the mucocutaneous junction, which is simply where the cutaneous portion of the foreskin transitions into the mucous membrane. And upon erection, we'll just watch this happen here as the penis becomes erect, keeping in mind that this is all an eversion process, that is an unfolding process. Foreskin everts farther and farther, keeping in mind that this green line represents what was the tip of the foreskin. So everything this side of the green line is the inner surface of the foreskin. There's the outer surface of the foreskin, and it's already down to the total length of the shaft of the penis. And here we see this line, which represents the mucocutaneous junction, clear back to the body. And so all of this area is only the inner surface of the foreskin. So this is a huge amount of tissue. It constitutes about half of the penile skin covering, or sometimes even more. Now, common sense would tell you if you remove half of the penile skin covering from a penis, you're going to diminish the sensibility, if you will, of the outer penile skin covering by half. But as we've seen, it's much worse than that, because the half that's removed is the most erogenous and highly nerve-laden half. And of course, as we all know, that's exactly what they had in mind when they initiated the surgery. Back in the old days, as in this article that came from, what year, 1895, and this kind of encapsulates the thinking, in my opinion, of what was going on at that time. And let me just read it. This is from Edgar J. Spratling, recorded in the medical record. He said, various kinds of apparatus that are intended to prevent the mobility of the foreskin are unsatisfactory. Castration is not to be considered. Awfully gracious of him. Complete section of the dorsal nerves of the penis, as I have previously advocated, is a rational procedure, but rather too radical for constant routine practice. Circumcision is undoubtedly the physician's closest friend and ally. So we find in here an example of the two twin fears: mobility You must understand, a mother sees the child moving the skin back and forth. It must be a highly pleasurable experience to be able to press against your penis, roll the skin back and forth. It's all internalized, and you can look at lay literature, and mothers were very, very concerned about this mobility of the penis. They were noticing that this mobile nature was causing their child to experience pleasure. My Lord. And, of course, there were different devices that were invented to restrict mobility. And the other twin fear, of course, was sensation. They wanted to desensitize the male's penis. And there's no question about that. I hope there's no question. Frederick Hodges has 1,400 articles from the medical literature that draw this direct connection between masturbation and all these diseases: epilepsy, prolapse of the rectum, hip joint disease, which is one of my favorites. The idea is that by masturbating, you lose so much energy that you fall over and crack your hip. So the foreskin is directly a causal factor in hip joint disease. And, of course, the consequence to this horrid act of masturbation, this mobility and sensation that's afforded the intact male is, drooling or slight eyes or big eyes or fingernail biting, poor posture. You couldn't escape the circumciser back then if they were working off of these criteria. Everyone was a candidate for circumcision. So, now to the good part, the physiology. So why is all this stuff here? How close are we, Marilyn?
10 minutes over.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let's get right to it. What happens is the two skins become one. They unfold, everything becomes one. This ridge band lies on the outer surface of the foreskin. So during sexual intercourse, in the inward motion of intercourse, this ridge band comes in contact with the vaginal wall. But then physiologically, what gets really interesting is in the outward motion of intercourse, the foreskin actually enfolds, everts, invaginates, if you will. That's to take into a sheath the glans penis. So what you've got is this unfolding, enfolding mechanism which allows the penis literally to glide in and out of itself during sexual intercourse. So the ridge band is stimulated by the vaginal wall in the inward motion, and in the outward motion, as the ridge band comes in contact with the corona, it's stimulated again. I also have to mention that, of course, this pops up over the glans. It enlarges the circumference of the corona. So given that the crura is stimulated by this contact, and given what I think we're going to hear tomorrow at lunch, that females that have experience with intact males, of course the male is trying to get this action as much as he can. There's a discernible, again anecdotal, but a discernible pleasurable sensation when this ridge band comes in contact with the corona, is stretched. All of this stretching also stimulates these nerve endings and then pops up over the head. So you're actually increasing the dimensions, if you will, of the penis when you have this enfolding mechanism. And anybody that's a mathematician, I'd love you to do this work because I don't know how to figure it out. But take 6 millimeters and put that around an average circumference of the penis. I'd like to know how much that grows by circumference. But the point I'm making is that if indeed the clitoral crura are stimulated by this expansion, that having a foreskin would make the girth of the penis even larger. And, I'm going to end here unless you want to talk about pain, because I wanted to include that, but I can get through it real fast. Okay. So, the modern medical myth, which persists today, if you can believe this, but was essentially discounted in the medical literature in 1985, and very briefly, this was brought about by lay people, a couple of women who observed their children in the neonatal intensive care unit, which has been referred to by physicians as a theater of whores, where they'll strap little babies down, give them a curare-like substance where it'll immobilize them, but they'll give them no anesthesia, and they'll crack open their chest and do open heart surgeries on them, all under the notion that infants are incapable of feeling pain. Well, because of the influence of these lay individuals in the early 1980s, about 6 studies were done, all of which used volunteers, children who are being circumcised as their subjects. They all concluded that infants feel pain. Anandan Hickey from the Department of Anesthesia at Harvard Medical School even went so far as to say that infants feel pain similar to but greater than that experienced by adults. So now, at least at least for those who are familiar with the research, this idea that infants feel no pain is not around any longer. What does persist, though, is this idea, which I find even more disgusting, that they don't remember the pain. Now, I can tell you, my experience goes farther than just this stuff. I go to the APA congresses, the Association of Pre- and Perinatal Psychology. These are the people that are looking from a psychological perspective at what babies go through. And the people that are the experts in the realm of memory don't know what memory is. We're just learning that the spinal column, for instance, has a memory of its own. Well, what's that about? You just have to realize we're just on the verge of learning so many new things about the human body. And the idea that you can subject infants to pain because they won't remember it is very perverse in my mind. I mean, maybe you can't consciously recall it, but the bottom line is it's just a horrid thing to do. And just as a matter of pain relief, the traditional pain relief modalities that are employed is to inject a dorsal block which has to go down through the buccal fascia, hit these teeny little dorsal nerves that run in 10 and 2 o'clock, and that will eliminate the pain in circumcision. Well, it doesn't. We get reports from nurses that the babies still scream. The reason for that is that, and this is something that even urologists, if you can believe it, don't know, and yet I've got 3 separate studies that all identify this as being the case. The lower third of the penis is innervated by the perineal nerve, not the dorsal nerves. And you can't affect the perineal nerves with the dorsal block. And also, this is from rhesus monkeys. This is getting a little out of hand, but there's neurites in the balanopreputial membrane, and nurses report that there's a special kind of scream that comes from the babies when you tear this membrane off. So, it doesn't matter whether the child is an adolescent in Turkey who's being mutilated, or a little girl in Arab countries or equatorial Africa, or a newborn child in the United States. It's always a larger person doing it to a smaller, helpless person. It's brutal, it's barbaric, it has absolutely no place in the realm of modern medicine, and yet it persists. I think that in the near future, this whole practice has got to be abandoned. It's going to die by implosion. My guess is it's going to die by explosion. And in a few years, it will be considered an amoral act. But I know a lot of you have suffered indignation just by being involved in this movement. So the only thing they'll be able to accuse us of when that happens is premature morality.